August 7th, 1942. The Solomon Islands. Dawn breaks over Guadalcanal with the kind of tropical beauty that makes men forget they are standing on the threshold of hell. The air is thick, not with moisture alone, but with something heavier, something unspoken. Japanese soldiers of the Imperial Navy's Special Naval Landing Forces crouch in the jungle shadows, their rifles gleaming with condensation, their breathing synchronized in the disciplined rhythm taught since childhood. They had been told the Americans are soft. They had been told the enemy lacks the spiritual fortitude to endure true combat. They had been told that Bushido, the way of the warrior, will carry them to inevitable victory. In less than 6 hours, that belief will shatter like porcelain under a hammer. The sound that breaks the morning is not a battle cry. It is mechanical. It is rhythmic. It is the sound of American naval guns firing in sequence from offshore destroyers, each blast calibrated, each shell landing where mathematics dictates it must. The jungle does not scream back. It simply disappears. Trees, earth, men, all consumed in synchronized explosions that speak not of rage, but of procedure. To understand what happened on Guadalcanal, one must first understand what the Japanese soldier carried with him into battle, not in his pack, but in his soul. Bushido was not merely a code, it was cosmology. It was the architecture of meaning in a culture that had spent centuries refining the art of death into something beautiful. From the time a Japanese boy could understand language, he absorbed the tales, the 47 Ronin who avenged their master and then committed ritual suicide, the samurai who faced overwhelming odds not to win but to demonstrate purity of spirit, the notion that surrender was not merely defeat but spiritual annihilation. By 1942, this ancient warrior ethic had been weaponized by the imperial state. The Japanese military indoctrination system, built on foundations laid during the Meiji Restoration, transformed Bushido from philosophical ideal into tactical doctrine. Soldiers were taught that death in battle was not tragedy but transcendence. The Senjin-kun, the military field code issued in 1941, made it explicit. Do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die to ensure you do not leave behind a bad name. This was not motivational rhetoric. This was operational reality. Japanese soldiers in China, in Southeast Asia, in the Philippines had demonstrated a willingness to charge machine gun positions armed with bayonets, to strap explosives to their bodies, to die in waves, because dying well was coded into their definition of manhood itself. And it had worked. The Japanese military machine had swept through Asia with a speed that stunned Western observers. Hong Kong fell in 18 days. Singapore, the supposed Gibraltar of the East, collapsed in 70. The Philippines, Malaya, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, each conquest seemed to confirm that spiritual discipline could overcome material disadvantage, that willpower could defeat firepower, that Bushido was not romantic delusion but strategic asset. The Americans, by contrast, were presumed to be everything Bushido was not. They were individualists in a culture that prized collective sacrifice. They were materialists in a world that demanded spiritual purity. They were the children of a nation that, so the Japanese narrative insisted, had grown fat on luxury and weak on democracy. Japanese propaganda painted American soldiers as jazz-listening, gum-chewing boys who would crumble the moment combat became uncomfortable. The initial engagements seemed to confirm this. At Pearl Harbor, at Wake Island, at Bataan, American forces had been caught unprepared, overwhelmed, forced into humiliating retreats and surrenders that Japanese officers cited as proof of moral inferiority. But propaganda is a poor teacher when the lesson plan is written by artillery.
The Americans who waited ashore at Guadalcanal on that August morning were not the same military force that had fled the Philippines. They were members of the 1st Marine Division, and they carried with them something the Japanese military had not accounted for. Institutional knowledge forged in the brutal honesty of American military culture. Where the Japanese system punished failure with shame, the American system studied it with cold pragmatism. After every defeat in the war's opening months, American commanders had conducted what they called lessons learned sessions, clinical autopsies of tactical failure designed not to assign blame but to extract survival knowledge. What emerged was a doctrine that married American industrial capacity with a uniquely democratic approach to warfare. It was called fire discipline, and it was revolutionary not because it was complex, but because it was the opposite. Fire discipline meant that every Marine, from private to colonel, understood a simple mathematical truth. Ammunition was not a scarce resource to be hoarded for moments of desperate heroism. It was a tool to be applied with the same systematic efficiency that Henry Ford applied to automobile production. The average American rifle squad on Guadalcanal carried more ammunition than an entire Japanese platoon. This was not accident, but design. U.S. logistics officers had calculated the tonnage, planned the supply chains, built the transport ships, and created a system where resupply was not a hope, but a schedule. Each Marine rifleman carried between 100 and 120 rounds of .30-06 Springfield ammunition. Each Browning automatic rifle gunner carried 240 rounds, with more in unit reserves. Each machine gun crew had access to thousands of rounds, preloaded in belts, stored in waterproof containers, ready to feed weapons that had been designed for exactly this kind of sustained fire. But ammunition meant nothing without the discipline to use it correctly, and this is where American training diverged most sharply from Japanese doctrine. Japanese soldiers were taught to conserve ammunition, to wait for the decisive moment, to make each shot count in service of a climactic charge. American Marines were taught the opposite. Establish fire superiority immediately, maintain it continuously, use overwhelming volume to suppress enemy movement, while maneuver elements closed from the flanks. It was not about individual marksmanship, though Marines trained for that too. It was about creating an environmental condition where the enemy could not function. The Japanese called their charges banzai attacks, 10,000 years of glory compressed into moments of transcendent violence. The Americans had a different name for what happened when Bushido met fire discipline. They called it a free fire zone. The first major Japanese counterattack came on the night of August 21, 1942, at a place that would become known as the Tanaru River, though it was actually Alligator Creek. Colonel Kianao Ichiki led 916 men of the 28th Infantry Regiment in a night assault designed to overwhelm the American perimeter through speed, shock, and the sheer ferocity of spirit that had broken Chinese and British lines across Asia. They moved through the jungle in near-perfect silence, their approach masked by rain and darkness, their bayonets fixed, their minds prepared for the moment of contact when warrior spirit would decide the outcome. What they encountered instead was geometry.
The Marines had spent 2 weeks digging. Not gloriously, there is no glory in shovel work, but systematically. They had created interlocking fields of fire, positions where every approach was covered by at least 2 machine guns, where mortars had pre-registered coordinates, where 37mm anti-tank guns had been repositioned to fire canister shot at human waves. When Ichiki's men burst from the jungle in their charge, screaming the battle cries that had terrified enemies across Asia, they entered a killing field designed by engineers and executed by men who had been trained to treat combat as a technical problem. The sound was unlike anything in samurai legend. It was not the clash of swords or the crack of individual rifles. It was the industrial roar of synchronized firepower. M1919 Browning machine guns firing 400 rounds per minute, each gun in sequence, so there was never a pause, never a moment when the wall of lead ceased.
Marine riflemen fired not when they had perfect targets, but in continuous rhythm, their M1 Garand rifles cycling semi-automatically, 8 rounds per clip, reload, 8 more rounds, the distinctive ping of the ejecting clip swallowed by the larger symphony of destruction. Japanese soldiers who had been trained since childhood to face death with dignity found themselves in a situation their training had never addressed. They could not reach the enemy. Men fell not in individual duels, but in rows, cut down by fire they could not locate, could not answer, could not overcome through courage alone. Those who survived the initial volleys and pressed forward found themselves tangled in barbed wire, mundane, industrial, utterly unheroic barbed wire, where they became stationary targets for machine gunners who had been trained to traverse and elevate their weapons with the precision of factory workers operating lathes. By dawn, 774 Japanese soldiers were dead, 15 were captured, and those only because they were unconscious. The Marines had lost 44 men. Colonel Ichiki, confronted with a defeat that Bushido provided no framework to process, burned his regimental colors and shot himself. This was not cowardice in the Japanese framework. It was the only honorable response to a situation that defied honor itself. How could a warrior tradition rooted in personal valor respond to a military system that treated combat as an engineering problem? How could the spiritual weapon of the sword compete with the industrial weapon of the machine gun belt? In the months that followed, the pattern repeated, with variations, but never with different outcomes. At Eldson's Ridge in September, at the Matanaikau River in October, at the final desperate November offensive, Japanese forces attacked with the same ferocious courage and met the same systematic destruction. Imperial commanders, unable to accept that their tactical doctrine was fundamentally flawed, attributed defeats to insufficient spirit, to warriors who had somehow failed to embody Bushido purely enough. The solution was always to attack again, with more determination, with greater willingness to die. But the Americans were learning too, and their learning was institutional. After each engagement, Marine units conducted what they called hot washes, immediate after-action reviews, where junior enlisted men could question senior officers' decisions, where tactical mistakes were cataloged without regard for rank or ego. This was democracy applied to warfare, the assumption that the best idea should win regardless of its source, that survival was more important than hierarchy, that the purpose of military culture was to create effectiveness, not to reinforce tradition. The symbolic object that came to represent this philosophical divide was not a weapon, but a machine gun belt. Japanese soldiers who overran American positions in rare successful local attacks found crates of them, long canvas belts studded with hundreds of brass cartridges, each one precisely manufactured, each one part of a supply chain that stretched back to factories in Pennsylvania and Connecticut. These belts represented everything the Japanese military was not: abundance over scarcity, industrial process over artisan craft, the assumption that material superiority could and should be designed into victory rather than overcome through spiritual transcendence.
Some Japanese soldiers collected these belts, kept them as talismans of a kind of warfare they were beginning to understand they could not defeat. Others burned them, destroyed them, as if eliminating the physical object could eliminate what it represented. But the belts kept coming. For every one destroyed, 10 more arrived on the next supply ship, because American logistics operated on a scale that Japanese planning had never imagined. By February 1943, when the last Japanese forces evacuated Guadalcanal in the night, the Imperial Army had lost approximately 31,000 men on the island. The Americans had lost 7,100. But more than soldiers had been lost. An entire conception of warfare had been tested against industrial modernity and found wanting.
In the years that followed, Japanese tactical doctrine would evolve. By 1944, the massed banzai charges largely ceased, replaced by defensive warfare that relied on prepared positions, tunnels, and a strategy of attrition designed to make every American advance as costly as possible. But this evolution came too late and changed too little. The fundamental contradiction remained, a military culture that valued death over adaptation, fighting an enemy that valued winning over dignity. American soldiers who fought through the Pacific Islands would later recall the courage of their Japanese opponents with a kind of baffled respect. They had fought men who would charge machine guns armed with bayonets, who would detonate grenades against their own chests rather than surrender, who would starve in jungle caves for months rather than admit defeat. But they had also learned that courage without adaptability was not a strength but a vulnerability, that Bushido was beautiful in the abstract and suicidal in the concrete. The machine gun belt became, in Marine culture, a symbol of a different kind of discipline, not the discipline of the individual warrior perfecting his spirit for the moment of death, but the discipline of a system perfecting its logistics for the reality of survival. It represented the unglamorous work of supply sergeants ensuring ammunition arrived on schedule, of engineers calculating fields of fire, of quartermasters loading ships with tons of brass and lead, of a military culture that had decided victory mattered more than glory. When the war ended in August 1945, Bushido did not disappear. It transformed. The same culture that had produced the kamikaze pilot and the banzai charge would produce the post-war Japanese economic miracle. The same discipline and collective sacrifice now channeled into manufacturing and innovation. The warrior ethic found new expression in corporate culture, in quality control, in the systematic pursuit of excellence that made Made in Japan transform from a joke to a standard of reliability. But the lesson of Guadalcanal remained, carved into the earth of that tropical island and into the institutional memory of the United States Marine Corps, that the most powerful weapon in modern warfare is not the willingness to die, but the capacity to learn, that democracy's great military advantage is not that it makes better warriors, but that it creates better systems where the private can question the general, where the failed tactic gets discarded regardless of tradition, where the purpose of courage is not to demonstrate purity, but to achieve objectives. The machine gun belt, that mundane object of canvas and brass, had proven more powerful than the sword, not because it was wielded by better men, but because it was produced by a better idea. That war is not poetry but logistics, not transcendence but mathematics, not the perfection of spirit but the application of resources towards rational ends. And in the end, Bushido met fire discipline and learned what industrial democracy had always known, that the future belongs not to those who die most beautifully, but to those who organize most effectively. The Japanese had admired their warrior tradition, had built a military culture around the perfection of death. The Americans had built theirs around the perfection of supply chains. On Guadalcanal, the supply chain won.